Welcome to the May 27, 2020 special board meeting of the Chino Valley Fire District Board of Directors. The time is 4 p.m. This is President Harvey Luth, and we will now begin the meeting. Please be advised that this meeting will be recorded. Please silence your cell phones and devices to reduce background noise or disruption. In accordance with the California Governor's Executive Order N-29-20, guidance from the California Department of Public Health, and in an effort to combat the spread of COVID-19, the Chino Valley Fire District will hold all regular and special meetings of the Board of Directors remotely until further notice. There will be no physical meeting location. All board members and staff are joining the meeting today by teleconference. The public may join the meeting real-time in listen-only mode. Instructions and the GoToWebinar URL link for the meeting are listed on the agenda. Our agenda is posted on our website at cvifd.org. Please be advised that when you join the meeting real-time, your screen name will appear on the GoToWebinar screen. The board will accept public comment on all items on the agenda and under public communications. The public has two options for participating in public comment. One option for participating in public comment was to submit comments to the clerk of the board by email at clerk@chofire.org prior to the beginning of the meeting. Comments received by email will be read real-time by the clerk of the board during the specified time. Emails are limited to 300 words. Please note that your name will be read into the record. The second option for participating in public comment real-time was to register prior to the meeting at the GoToWebinar URL listed on this agenda. If you have registered for public comment, the clerk of the board will call on you and unmute your microphone when it is your turn to speak. Attendees may also need to unmute their own devices to be heard. When your name is called, begin the public comment by stating your name and address, which is optional for the record. Comments must be limited to 5 minutes. For a recorded viewing of the board meeting, you may access the Fire District website the day following the meeting at www.cvifd.org and click on Video Archive. I will now open the meeting and take roll call. Please answer when I call your name. Director Wynn Williams.
I'm here.
Thank you. Director Mike Krieger.
Here.
Director John DeMonico.
Here.
Vice President Sarah Ramos-Evinger.
Present.
And myself, Harvey Luth. I would like to remind the board and staff to please mute your phone until it is your time to speak to cut down on any background noise. And now, if you would please join me in the flag salute. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now we'll have the invocation. Henry Aguilar, Fire District Chaplain, is joining us to present the invocation. Chaplain?
Good afternoon, everyone. Let us pray. Father God, we come before you and ask for your blessings upon our special board meeting, blessings upon the board of directors and our entire fire family. We ask for wisdom and direction throughout this meeting as we discuss the items on the agenda. And may we give thanks to you, Lord, for you are good and your love endures forever. And for it is in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Chaplain. All right. Clerk of the board, do we have any changes to the agenda?
President Luth, we have no changes to the agenda.
Thank you. Public hearing. Public hearings shall be held in accordance with the following procedure. Any person wishing to speak was provided with information on the agenda for participating in the public hearing through the public comment process by contacting the clerk of the board. When addressing the board of directors, please state your name, address or area of residence, which is optional, and organization or association you represent, if any, for the record, spelling your last name. We have properties declared for weed abatement. Purpose is for the public to comment on the declaring and noticing of property owners for weed abatement. The public hearing is now open. Fire Marshal Danielle Barnes, please present your report.
Good afternoon, President Luth and members of the board. At the April 22nd special board meeting, resolution number 2020-04 was approved and adopted, identifying properties throughout the district that either have the presence of or the potential of a fire hazard due to weeds. On April 24th, notices advising respective property owners were mailed out. The notice advises them of the deadline to comply, which is today, as well as letting them know that failure to abate the noted hazard is subject to an administrative citation and action by our office to abate the property utilizing our private contractor. Our office will begin re-inspections on May 28th and will take the noted actions to bring properties into compliance. In accordance with our resolution, we are to hold a public hearing allowing property owners to address the board on this matter. It is recommended that the board of directors receive public comment on the declaring and noticing of property owners for weed abatement and subsequent action and charges, as well as make any rulings on any and all objections raised regarding the proposed removal of weeds and said charges.
All right. Clerk of the board, do we have any public comments on this agenda item?
The fire district did not receive public comments for this public hearing.
Okay. Then the public hearing is now closed. This is the time for the board to comment. Director Wynn Williams.
I have no comments.
Director Williams, if you're saying anything, we're not hearing you.
I have no comments. I just want to
Thank
thank Director, not Director, but Ms. Barnes for doing such a good job.
Thank you. Director Krieger.
No comments as well.
Thank you. Director DeMonico.
No comments, and thank you, Danielle.
Thank you. Vice President Ramos Evinger.
No comment.
All right. And myself, I have no comments other than, yes, thank you to our Fire Marshal Danielle Barnes for an excellent job as always. So thank you. So I would note there is no vote required on this item. The purpose of the public hearing was for staff to present a report and receive public comment. With that, we're going to move on to public communications. This is the time and place for the general public to address the board of directors about subjects that do not appear elsewhere on the agenda. The public may address items on the agenda at the time addressed by the board. Due to board policy and Brown Act requirements, action may not be taken on any issue not on the agenda. When you address the board, please state your name and address, which is optional, prior to making your remarks. Please limit your comments to 5 minutes. Clerk of the board, do we have any requests to speak?
President Luth, we did not receive any requests to speak under public communications.
Thank you. Next, we have old business, at which we have none. And so we're on to new business. And under new business, we have the 2020-21 original budget workshop. Purpose is to conduct a 2020-21 original budget workshop to provide budget input and direction to staff. Finance Director Steve Heide, please present your report.
Thank you, President Luth. Members of the board, good afternoon. Before I commence my presentation, I just wanted to ask Chief Shackelford if he might have any opening remarks.
Thank you, Steve. I just wanted to say hello to the board. Welcome. Much easier if we could see you in person. I want to take the opportunity to thank our staff, and this is not only suppression staff for continuing to do a great job during these very challenging times, but our staff here at administration. And a special thank you to our finance team for putting this budget together, and that's under the leadership of our finance director, Steve Heide. So I appreciate their efforts, and I look forward to hearing your comments from the board tonight about this budget. That concludes my comments. Thank you, Steve.
Well, thank you, Tim, and just echo the shout out to all the staff involved in this budget development process, the board for their direction this evening and beyond, as well as their leadership. And finally, it's specific to our finance team, Christine, Don, and Vicki, who have done a fantastic job in bringing the product we are discussing here today to the board. So we're pleased to have this budget workshop, as Chief Shackelford mentioned. Not ideal to be doing this virtually, but nonetheless, we'll press on and move forward. So with that, I want to begin with a series of opening slides with regard more specifically to looming recession. And so our first slide here, there we go, is a 20-year graph, and it's similar to a graph that is contained in the budget document itself. But this graph shows districts' significant revenues over the last 20 years. And in particular, I wanted to focus on the Great Recession of 08 and 09. It basically was about an 18-month recession from December of 7 through about middle of the calendar year of 09. And you see that represented by a light blue bar that's running through sort of the center of the graph there with the 18-month recession arrow on its right. And then you see a gap of basically about 18 months and the 4-year impact from fiscal 2010 through 2013 associated with the Great Recession. So, you know, we're in unprecedented times, obviously, and how this recession that's looming may impact the district in the long term is speculative in nature, but the best point of reference we have in recent history is what we went through associated with the Great Recession now 10 plus years ago. So in preparing for this meeting, I went back to the budget documents associated with that time frame. And so just as sort of a point of reference, in the fiscal 09 budget, which was smack dab in the middle of the Great Recession, we were projecting a 5% budgeted revenue increase. Turns out in that 09 fiscal year, we actually hit 6%. As the board is aware, we tend to budget conservatively, but that was smack dab in the middle of the actual recession. So in the fiscal years 10 through 13, there was a continuing comment with regard to the revenue projections, basically to the effect that the economic downturn continues to impact assessed values in area real estate, and we are projecting slight between flat revenues and slight decreases in revenues. And we essentially repeated that message for 4 successive years. But as we shared with those of you that were involved in that time frame with the district then, we're slow to realize the impacts of recession because of the nature of the delays in timing, which we'll talk a bit more about here in a minute. And conversely, we're also slow to come out of that recession after the fact. So sort of the good news is it's a delayed impact. The bad news is it's a delayed impact on the upside. So with that said, I think the good news here is that our property tax revenues, which represent the lion's share of the district revenues, are generally stable. And the difference between the recession we face here, the COVID recession, and the Great Recession, is that there's no housing bubble versus obviously in 08 and 09, there was a significant housing bubble and therefore a significant impact on assessed values for real estate. So that's one plus in our favor. The bad news here is that this event is unprecedented. So there really is no model that speaks to the potential short, intermediate, even long-term impacts of recession. So who really knows? Difficult to predict, but again, this is the best model we have looking historically. The other sort of bad news here is that back when we faced the challenges of the Great Recession, we didn't have the PERS obligations that exist today. Part of that was when PERS policies changed and they began to have employers pay a minimum unfunded actuarial liability payment that continues to increase, which we'll talk in a bit more detail here about in a minute. And the other challenge or bad news here is that PERS has an assumed rate of return on the assets in our pension plan of 7%. So to the extent that the equity markets do not recover and deliver a return of 7% at June 30th of this year, then those asset losses will be amortized in future years and will have impacts on the district, which again, we'll talk about in more detail here in a couple of minutes. So I want to conclude my comments on this particular slide here in just a second with a couple of additional sort of perspectives on what we're looking at here. So for those of you that are following other local governments, cities, partner cities, the County of San Bernardino, even larger organizations, the state, federal government, et cetera, there are many public agencies that are dependent on sales and transit occupancy or tourism taxes. And those are obviously way, way off. And those impacts are immediate to long-term, depending on how long this continues. So in comparison to that sort of challenge, we don't have the immediacy of the elasticity in revenues that cities in particular have, cities, counties, even the state has. So the good news with that is that, in terrible times like now, we're not immediately hit with a big revenue downturn like the cities are. Conversely, again, when times are good, those revenue streams tend to expand and allow those agencies to bring in substantially more revenue as the market upticks and times are good economically. So that just gives you sort of a little point of reference versus the district's challenges and what you may be hearing from city leaders and staff and reading in the local media. And then finally, for those of you that have heard economic discussion about V-shaped recovery versus U-shaped recovery, I think this graph very well articulates a U-shaped recovery in the Great Recession. So if you look toward that red shaded area smack dab in the middle of the graph, and you see that we were at periods of basically -1% return or annual difference in revenues rather, versus flat or zero, versus the years on either end of that U, where we were 6% and we bumped up all the way to 10% in recovery. You see clearly that that forms a U shape. So it was a quick drop. It was several years of flat to negative revenues. And then in year 5, large pickup. So that is a sort of a classic U-shaped recovery versus if this graph looked a little different and we went from 6 to -1, right back up to 10 in the next year, that would be more of a V-shaped recovery. So there's been some speculation among economists and financial gurus whether this will be a quick rebound as we come out of social distancing and the economy recovers, or whether this will be a sustained downturn that looks more like a U versus a V. As time goes on, in general, I think there seems to be more of a consensus toward a U-shaped recovery versus the V. The V obviously would be preferable so that we could pull out of this quickly, but nevertheless, it's speculative, and ultimately history will judge how that will look. So with that, if there are no questions, I'll move on to the next graph. Okay, hearing none, we'll move forward. So just to provide a little additional context in terms of the delayed fiscal impacts of recession on the district, this graphic, which is duplicated again in the budget document, shows that year one is our next year's budget, our fiscal 2021 budget. And so what we expect in the way of fiscal impact as a result of a recession here from the COVID emergency is that there may be an uptick in property tax delinquencies. We would not anticipate this to have a significant impact on the revenue stream, but there could be a higher level of property tax delinquencies, which might result in delays in property tax receipts. So that could impact us this next fiscal year. At this point, we think relatively in a minor way. And the other challenge for us, we built a flat revenue stream into the budget with regard to user fee assumptions for next fiscal year. Difficult to know if businesses have closed and will not reopen, and of course, what impact in the short term this may have on new construction and associated inspections. So we could see some challenges in the user fee area next fiscal year, but we expect that again to be relatively minor. So in year one, based on the best available information, which is for next fiscal year, we're not anticipating any significant impacts. As we move into years 2 and 3, however, there is potential for more significant impact. We talked about reduced assessed property values during the Great Recession. Again, in the absence of a housing bubble, we're not anticipating a huge downturn in assessed values, but it remains to be seen. If consumer confidence is low, if folks are slow to pull out of the unemployment spectrum, it could have impact over time on assessed property values. It could impact resales by virtue of fewer houses being sold and higher property tax bases on any gains. And also on new construction slowdown and those delayed projects coming on the tax roll. So we'll talk a bit more about property taxes in the next graphic, but the first impact associated with property taxes would not be until 2 years out in fiscal 21-22. And then finally, the first impacts of a downturn in the investment return for PERS, i.e. a less than 7% return at June 30th of this year, would impact us beginning in 22-23, and we'll talk more about that again in a minute. But you can clearly see not much impact next fiscal year, potential impacts beginning on the property tax side the year after that, potentially combined with PERS increases the year after that. And as I've indicated, year 2+ and year 3+ means that these impacts could stretch over multiple years. Again, remains to be determined, but nevertheless, that sort of gives you the clear indication that for next year, we're not anticipating much in the way of recessionary impact, but in the years thereafter, the potential is more significant. Next slide, please. So this has got a lot going on it, but basically the message here, this is from our consultants at HDL, our property tax consultants, is that there's a 12 to an 18-month lag for any changes in assessed value getting on the tax roll. So in this illustration covering the January 1 of 20 property tax roll, that reflects in district revenues in 21-22. So our property tax revenues are already locked in for this fiscal year. And then depending on what happens with the roll when it closes at January 1 of 21, that will impact the following fiscal year and beyond, as we talked about in the last slide. So, we may see some shakeup in real estate for the last half of the calendar year here in 2020, and that would impact revenues beginning in 21-22. It could also be, sometime next year before we're seeing impacts in real estate, and that would impact the following fiscal year and beyond. So again, the take-home message is that there's a 12 to an 18-month lag before we're seeing any impact on the revenue side for changes in the real estate market. Now, with respect to PERS on the next slide, this graphic was provided by PERS in a webinar in April, and this shows how their policies would impact any asset loss at June 30th of this year. So again, if PERS realizes less than a 7% return on assets, that's considered an asset loss. So if, for an example, when PERS was doing these webinars, the market was way down, and PERS was recommending that you assume at that point that they would have a negative 4% return on assets, that in effect becomes an 11% loss. They're expecting 7, they get -4, so you add those two together and that's an 11% loss. Thankfully, there has been, as I'm sure you are well aware, significant market recovery since the early March low point in the markets. But ultimately, what happens at June 30th when PERS closes out the fiscal year, at that point in time, will impact rates beginning, as you see on this graphic, in 22-23. And there's a 5-year ramp up in the rate increases to where in 26-27, those rates are fully impacted, and then it's for 15 full years thereafter. So a delay in impact, a 5-year ramp up, and then a 15-year stream of steady payments beyond that. So going on to the next slide, again, courtesy of PERS. This showed, sort of for a sample safety plan, a variety of impacts on rates depending on the return on investment. So the blue indicator is basically if PERS is hitting their 7%, you see the payments are stable and over time decreasing. And then from there, it goes up depending on the degree of loss. So if PERS has a break-even year, which again, in effect is a 7% loss, but a 0% return, you see that in the gray line. -5% is the purple line, and then finally -10% is the green line. So the -10 return results in a 17% loss. And you see how the payments spike through 26-27, and then over time begin to come down. Next slide, please. So what we've modeled for you here is the projected impacts of a 0% return, which is about where PERS was as of 5/14. The market has moved up a bit since then, although not substantially. So these numbers would slightly improve if we were to close this out as of today. But again, it's what the market bears at June 30th that ultimately determines how the fiscal year is closed out and how that begins to impact rates in 22-23. So the red section of these bars represents the estimated impact of the market loss at June 30, 20. And so under this scenario, PERS closes out at a 0 return at June 30th, which, by the way, from an editorial perspective, who among us would have thought, 3 or 4 months ago that we'd all be happy if the market got back to 0 for a return for the fiscal year. I certainly would not have been in that camp, but nevertheless, this forecast is hoping for at least a break even in the return on investments. So with that, if we were at 0% beginning of 22-23, PERS starts that 5-year ramp up. And so these are in fractions of $1 million or decimals of $1 million. So in fiscal 22-23, it's an extra $300,000 in PERS payments. In 24, it's 570. In 25, it's 1.1 million. And then in 26, it's 26 and beyond, it's the 1.4 million in additional costs, and that extends for an additional 15 years. So asset gains and losses over time can have a significant impact on our payments. Now, it's conceivable as we move out beyond June 30 of 20 into next fiscal year that PERS could have a banner return in fiscal 21. That would drive down payments over time. So each year that there's an asset loss or that there's a gain, that will have an impact, certainly in the intermediate and potentially long term, on our rates. But again, the information that we have available now is where we potentially stand as of June 30th. So we close out at 0, then it starts adding to the payments beginning in 23. And on top of that, as I indicated with that opening slide, we didn't have the challenges with increasing PERS payments back during the Great Recession that we have now. So even if you take away that red portion of these bars and PERS hits the 7% at June 30th, we're still looking at significant increases over time in our PERS obligation, with the blue section representing the fixed unfunded actuarial payments and the orange section representing our normal or current cost. And so you see that the UAL is growing at a much quicker rate than the normal cost, and that's based on PERS policies of trying to get more money into the system to stabilize the pension system in the long term and to get employers closer to 100% funding. So even if we didn't have the downturn, even if we didn't have an asset loss, we would be going from the 21 budget of about 6.75 million in next year's budget for PERS costs to approaching 9.4 million without the asset loss. So the 9.4, although that's still a projection, is largely going to hit us regardless of this closeout at June 30. But if we added 1.4 on top of that, then you'd be going to nearly $11 million in pension obligations 6 or 7 years out. So again, this is just for reference to indicate that the downturn will not hit us in the very short term, but potentially has significant consequences over the next several years. So with that, as we wind up this part of the presentation, onto the next slide. So just sort of to recap and offer some additional perspective, 1% of revenues equals plus or minus about $45,000 or $450,000 on the property tax side. So, for every percent we're up or down by 1%, it's approaching $500,000 in district revenues. And Hopefully, the impact on real estate assessed values is minimal through this, but again, remains to be seen. And again, PERS increases, if any, associated with investment losses at the end of this fiscal year will begin to hit us in fiscal 23. So with that, before I move into the 2021 budget presentation, are there any questions with regard to what's been presented with potential impacts of recession at this time?
Let me just go down each director just to see if there's any questions so we aren't speaking over each other. Director Williams.
Thank you, guys. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I was wanting to see, Steve, can we go back to, I think, the third picture that you had there?
The one with the 20-year projection?
I believe that was it.
Yes.
I'm going to see if I can remember my question. I didn't write it down, but
That's the recession moving slide. Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I had something that I was going to ask you about, and let me see if I can remember. I should have written it down, but I wanted to hear what you had to say. I guess the thing, well, I can't remember, so let's just move on. I'm sorry, I can't remember. So move on, please. I have no other questions.
Okay, we'll leave this slide up for now then.
All right, Director Krieger.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for the update on that and the explanation. When PERS comes out with their fiscal year in review, how quickly after June 30th will you know where we stand with those projections?
Well, in a definitive sense, unfortunately, we won't know anything until summer after next. So in that respect, Director Krieger, the rates for 22-23 have already been locked in based on PERS return at June 30-19, but the actuarial valuation is delayed essentially another year. So we won't be getting our 21-22 rates until about August. So if you project a year forward based on the June 30-20 close, we won't get those rates until August of 21. So in terms of having a definitive fiscal impact, it's going to be, 11, 12 months out from the close of June 30th. With that said, our actuaries from Bartel and Associates have provided us with a working model where we should be able to run the PERS rate of return through that model and within reason get a pretty good projection. I wouldn't take it to the bank as a guarantee, but I think it's a good working base for us to be able to determine what we think the impacts will be based on the information provided by PERS. So nothing definitive till about August of 21 when the PERS valuations come out, but the working model should help us along with that. And so I would say probably in about, PERS rates are generally finalized in about August. So about August, we should be able to have a good sort of working projection of what we think the fiscal impact will be in the following, in 22-20, beginning in 22-23.
Excellent, thank you. I'd be very interested in seeing what those models, are projecting when you get that data put together. Thank you.
Certainly, excellent question. Thank you.
Director DeMonico. John, if you're speaking, we're not hearing you. John? John, we're not hearing you. I'm gonna move on. John, if you've got something to say,
Can you hear me now?
there you are.
There we go. Okay. No, no questions at this time. And Steve, thank you. That was a great presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice President Ramos Evinger.
No questions. Thank you very much for the detailed information.
And I don't necessarily have questions, but I did have questions, and so a lot of not necessarily everything you presented, but some of these slides were very helpful in your explanation. You've answered some questions I might have had otherwise, so I appreciate it very much. The slides are very helpful. I appreciate all that, the effort to provide those. So with that, Steve, we'll let you continue on.
Thank you. Well, we're going to now transition to the 2021 original budget, which has been posted to the website and was provided both electronically and in hard copy to the directors. And so I don't intend, this is an exhaustive document. There's a wealth of information in here. I do intend to cover in some detail many of the pages and many of the sections, but not necessarily cover each page. So if we can, I'd like to sort of go through, certainly my presentation will be sequential in order, but if I've skipped over a page or pages that you have questions on, if President Luth wouldn't mind, I would ask that we take any questions or any director questions or comments as we move through, and if we need to bounce back a page or two, we could certainly do so. So President Luth, does that sound reasonable?
Certainly. So if a director has a question, we'll just chime in and let you respond.
All right, thank you. We're going to start with page 7, in the, which is the second page of the transmittal letter. One more page, please. There we go. And I just want to bring to your attention that total emergency calls, nearly 13,000 in 2019. We do capture this data by calendar year, so we don't have this from a fiscal perspective, but the most recent update to our numbers is almost 13,000 for the end of 2019, and that was about a 6% increase over the prior year. And over the aggregate 10-year period, we've seen an increase from about 9,000 calls in 2010 to 13,000 in 2019. In aggregate, about almost a 50% increase over the course of 10 years. So we know that our volumes are increasing, our calls for service are increasing. Obviously, that puts some pressure on operations and the need to ensure we're meeting the needs of the public through the increased demands. So just wanted to point that out. And then starting in the section below, just want to applaud the board for their support and commitment to excellence and transparency. And that's evidenced here at the bottom of page 7 in the district's continuing participation with the Government Finance Officers Association award program. In this particular case, an award for excellence in financial reporting. Moving on to page 8. And continuing along that same theme, we've also received awards for distinguished budget presentation from GFOA. And hats off again to the board for the district's participation in the District of Distinction program and our platinum recognition, the first fire district to achieve that award, and it's very prestigious. There are a limited number of districts in California that hold the Platinum DoD Award, and so again, evidence of our commitment to transparency, excellence, and maintaining the public trust. I think those are important sort of initial statements outlined in the transmittal letter of the budget. And then if you look there at the bottom of page 8, we covered a lot of this in detail, but beginning at the bottom of the page there is for the next couple of pages thereafter, a fair amount of information with regard to the potential implications of the COVID-19 emergency on the district, both next fiscal year and beyond, as we've discussed. So if you haven't had a chance to review that portion of the transmittal in detail, I would encourage you to do so. And as we move toward the bottom of page 10 next. So we have a number of new items this year, and I'm not going to take the time to go through those in detail, but our first due Community Connect application is an exciting program that is being put forth here through the budget allocation that really allows us to work more effectively with the public to protect life and property, and so we're pleased about that. Beginning on page 11, at the top there, just a few more to share. FirstWatch, we will have been working initially through Confire for FirstWatch data analytics. Now we will be contracting directly with FirstWatch, and FirstWatch turns raw data into meaningful information, helping agencies improve field communication, operational performance, and ultimately patient outcomes. So we're pleased to have that in the budget this year. Tablet Command as well. If you see a common theme here, it is toward technology. So Tablet Command, again, is an important tool that will help with emergency operations out in the field. And then additionally, the four new Pierce Puck engines that are in the budget for next fiscal year will significantly enhance the fleet, and as indicated out there, will result in savings going forward, not only through our fleet being branded more toward a consistent type of engine manufacturer, but will also save in terms of both the acquisition costs by ordering 4 engines versus 2, which was an option for the board, and in the long term will also save on fleet maintenance. So next page, page 12, please. And then hats off to the board for their commitment to state leadership with Board Vice President Evinger participating in CSDA, California Special Districts Association, professional development and membership committees, and Director DeMonico for his leadership as a committee member on the legislative and fiscal committees of CSDA. So thank you for your leadership on that. And then finally, on the bottom of page 12, goes without saying for those of us that have lived through the budget development process for a number of years, but it is important, I think, to say that this budget process kicked off last December, spanned some 6 months of extensive planning, meetings, and study sessions, culminating with the workshop we're having here today and approval of the budget anticipated for the June meeting. And so this really is quite a process to get through this. And over the course of developing this budget at a staff and at a management level, in excess of $500,000 in net costs were cut from original budget proposals that were submitted. So the product you have in front of you today is much leaner than the initial iterations that came through as a result of diligent work on the staff's part to make every effort to be as fiscally conservative as possible. And I might add that the majority of that work was done prior to the fiscal impacts or anticipated fiscal impacts of COVID. So certainly we, have sort of gone back and taken a fresh look after having received initial reports of potential impacts of COVID, but we were already well on our way to doing that prior to that. So moving on to page 13. And I do promise, by the way, I'm not going to go over every single page, but there are several more pages in succession before we skip a few. So Page 13, just a quick highlight. This is presents a 5-year budget summary, which shows that we are going to be dipping a little bit, quite a bit actually, into fund balance next year, primarily as a result of the capital requirements associated with 4 new engines. However, we do have savings available from our capital replacement portion of fund balance. And so when we bring those back in to the budget presentation, we actually are showing a slightly net positive revenue of about $84,000. And so that's based on projected operating revenues of $47.2 million against expenditures of $49.1. We add in the $2 million in transfers. And on the revenue side there at the bottom of this page, you see that we are projecting a healthy increase of 4.8% in revenues. 5-year average is about 5.1%. And we're not going to go back to that recession looming graphic that I presented at the beginning of the presentation. But just to add context, remember the first year that we went into the Great Recession, we projected 5% revenue and we realized 6%. So we're sort of in a similar mindset at this point that the impacts will be minimal. So next year will be healthy with regard to revenues. And it will be the years after that provides for some uncertainty. So at this point, I think it's sort of my first editorial comment in here that, to the extent that the district at the board's direction is operating as conservatively as we can this next fiscal year and beyond, it's a lot easier to course correct when you've been conservative rather than potentially just waiting till the bad news hits us and then trying to react and recover at that time. So just wanted to add that additional perspective that even though next fiscal year revenues look healthy, we are anticipating some level of impact, potentially significant, depending on how this ultimately plays out. So, we might be having a different discussion next year as we contemplate the 21-22 budget and potentially in a number of successive years thereafter. So actually, I'm going to skip a couple of pages now and go to page 16. So drawing your attention toward the top of the page there, the district's forecasted property tax growth is actually 5.5%. That's compared to a 10-year average of about 6.6%. So again, property taxes sort of rule the day. So that's accounting obviously for in excess of the 4.8 growth that we talked about for the total revenue stream. If you look at the bottom of that page, the reason why it's only 4.8 is because we are expecting a slight decrease in other revenues, and that's primarily associated with the fact that we are anticipating a lower rate of interest returns on investments next year, and so that pretty much accounts for a decrease in other revenues. So going on to the next page, page 17. Toward the bottom there, the expenditure recap. Total non-capital expenditures are expected to increase only about 2.1%. And that's a combination of salary and benefits, 2.9%, and supplies and services actually decreasing by about 2.1%. On to page 18, the next slide, please. We've changed this from prior year presentations in terms of the chart 7 there on page 18. And this year we've added into the presentation in the light blue upper part of those bars a workers' compensation open position factor. And so just to refresh the Board of Public's recollection on this, we do account in our budget for open positions. The effect of open positions or vacancies, unfilled positions, is that it tends, since we operate on the emergency services side in a 24/7 constant staffing model, results in additional coverage or overtime costs to the extent that open positions, or partially in this case, positions where we have staff on work comp, are covered by overtime. And so what that means is there's an inverse relationship between filled positions and the need for overtime. So to the extent we have more vacancies, folks are working more overtime to cover those shifts. Obviously, to the extent positions are filled, there's less need for additional coverage. There are other factors that impact overtime, emergency responses in and out of area, et cetera, et cetera. But a big driver is vacant positions. So if you look at the chart there in the 5-year presentation in 17, 18, 19, well, really 17, 18 in particular, the effect of workers' comp, illnesses and injuries was not too substantial, but you see it began to pick up in 19. For this fiscal year 20, we're expecting that to be closer to 5. We're actually cautiously optimistic that we can back that off a little bit next fiscal year. That remains to be seen. But for next fiscal year, we're anticipating, because of continuing challenges in work comp, potentially an average of about 4 full-time equivalent workers being out on injury or illness next fiscal year, combined with potential for an average of roughly 6 open positions. We have open positions primarily through retirements that take place, and then delays in filling those just because of the recruitment process takes time, and so we can't necessarily match those two up, obviously. Combined with the fact that there are significant competition for other agencies having openings and getting positions filled. So this is an important indicator in our budget. And so comparing current year to next year, in total, we're anticipating about an average of 10 openings at any given time versus 13.6 projected in the current fiscal year on an aggregate basis. Going to the next page, how some of this translates.
Steve, this is Win, and I was wondering if you could back up just that one page. I just have a question on the overtime. Is that millions of dollars, that 8.2?
The 8.2 and no, that's the number of full-time equivalent positions.
Oh, okay. So we're not talking dollars here.
No, that's a number of full-time equivalents.
Okay, so these are open positions, 8.2, 8.9, 5.3.
Yes.
Okay, that's all I need to know. What's the 1.7 and 0.9 and what's above?
That represents the equivalent associated with personnel that are out on injury and illness for workers' comp.
Okay, and the 8.9 then is what? That's just an open position?
If you're looking at the fiscal 18 numbers, yes, 8.9 was open positions and 1.7 was workers' compensation.
Okay, that's all I needed. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no problem. Page 19. So in terms of the workers' compensation, if you look there at the paragraph that starts there with staff is working closely with safety personnel, the 21 budget includes $3.4 million in associated workers' comp costs. And to Director Williams' question about overtime, at least as it relates to workers' compensation, we would anticipate that those 4 FTE positions essentially translate to about 3.4 million in costs between the medical component with and legal and claims administration component, which is about 2.3 million, and then the backfill or overtime component of 1.1. So you aggregate the two of those, that's 3.4. That is consistent with the current fiscal year, but the fiscal 20 numbers were up or have been up significantly over the prior years. So I guess the good news, if there is a bit of good news, we're projecting it largely flat, but it was substantially higher this year than it had been in years prior. So our hopes over time is that we'll be able to not only keep that flat, but hopefully reduce that portion of the budget over a period of time as we continue to work closely with our health and wellness committees and our administrators to effectively manage those claims and work for the benefit and the health of our employees. So going on then quickly to page 20. So in capital outlay, 3.5 million there toward the middle of the page. The lion's share of that is 2.9 million for the 4 replacement engines. There's a few other significant capital outlay items highlighted there, including the district LED project, which we're pleased to indicate should pay itself off in roughly 6 years at an average annual utility cost projected savings of about $28,000 a year. On to page 21, please. So other initiatives funded through this budget, employee cost sharing of retirement contributions. We're anticipating about 2.3 million in cost savings associated with employee contributions toward pension costs. So any of the district expenditure numbers that we're talking about are net of that 2.3 million, but that is an impressive number. And so thank you to the board for their leadership and also to the leadership of our unions and as well as our unrepresented personnel in agreeing to contribute their full share of the cost associated with retirement contributions, 2.3 projected for this year. Continuing on that same theme on page 22. So if you look at that graphic there in chart 8, cumulatively, when we started, now it's been 7 years that we've had employees contributing toward pensions in excess, including the 21 budget, in excess of $11 million will have been contributed by employees over the 7-year period toward their retirement benefits. And we'll now skip forward to page 27. So as we conclude the transmittal letter portion of the budget, you'll see there that right in the fund balance paragraph that we anticipate fund balance of about 23.5 million at June 30, 21, 17 million unrestricted, the balance of that 6 million in the district's 115 trust, which is restricted exclusively for the funding of pension obligations, and that the 21 budget unrestricted fund balance represents about 35% of budgeted expenditures for next fiscal year. So we're pleased about that. And then in conclusion of this portion of the presentation, the 21 budget presents a healthy, structurally balanced and fiscally prudent roadmap for next fiscal year. So we're pleased to deliver that. As we move on into the financial trends section of the document on page 31, Beginning here, we have several graphs that I just want to briefly comment on. So here on 31, this shows a 10-year trend in total revenues. Those are represented by the bars there, and then the line, the jagged line running through there is showing as a percent of revenue how property tax changes depending on the year. So looking to the far left, total revenues were about 28 million in 2012. That represented 97.5% in property tax associated revenue. And we got sort of to the low point at 93% in property tax revenues in 18 and 19. That was due to increases, primarily increases in user fee revenues combined with fairly significant level of mutual aid recoveries for out of area events in those 2 fiscal years. Now you see in 20 and 21 a bit higher proportion of revenues associated with property taxes, and that is again in part based on the fact that we've had less mutual aid activity this fiscal year and anticipate next year. It's difficult to know from year to year, but thankfully this year we have had less need for mutual aid. There's been fewer large-scale statewide events, thankfully, this year. I know we haven't yet got to summer and beyond, but I think that's a bit of good news that there's a lower level of mutual aid activity throughout the state. So moving on to the next slide, next page, 32. So this shows our property tax revenue comparison between 10 years ago at 2012 and 21. We're at 27.2 on the property tax related revenue side, now 45.1. As I indicated, 1% property tax related revenues, about $450,000. And so we've had healthy growth in property taxes over the last bunch of years. You see there has been some changes in the mix. 10 years ago, approximately 64% of that represented secured revenues. Now that's 69%. In part, that shift is due to the fact that there's some shrinkage in the current services portion, which went from 26 to 24. That is the equity agreement with the city of Chino, and that changed primarily due to the elimination of the redevelopment agency in Chino and some contractual changes between the district and the city, combined with the fact that the additional growth in secured has to do with more real estate coming on to the tax rolls between residential development and commercial development. And so residential deeded properties fall into that secured bucket. And so because of that growth combined with the elimination of Chino's RDA, we have seen a shift more toward the secured bucket of revenues. Moving on to
Steve.
Certainly, yes.
So before you move on, so when I'm looking at the graph on page 31 to 30, and then looking at the pie on 32, so on 31, where we're showing 96%, that bar of our total revenue is property tax. So this pie chart on 32 is how that's broken out. That's the relationship between the two.
Yes, the pie charts on page 32 represent that 96%.
Yeah, okay, good, yeah, thank you.
Certainly. Okay, so if there's no other questions there, then I'll move on to 33. Commented briefly about other revenues in the prior section in the transmittal letter. This again just shows it a little bit differently, that you saw in 18 and 19 a spike in other revenues, a combination of growth in user fees and mutual aid recoveries. By the way, for the balance of 20, we've sort of assumed, that it will have some impact on user fees as a result of the economic slowdown, and maybe a slight continuing effect next fiscal year, combined with flat revenues in mutual aid recoveries. So that 4% of revenue slightly decreasing for next fiscal year. So on to page 34. So here on page 34, there are a couple of pieces that are missing in terms of the descriptions here associated with the slide, or the legend, if you will. So the items that are listed there, salaries and benefits and services supplies, represent the vast majority of the district's expenditures. What you're missing from the presentation, it just got cut off as this was moved over from one type of document to another, is the portion that shows that the very upper portion of those lines, or bars rather, is capital outlay. So the smallest upper portion is capital outlay. You see it is more significant in the 21 budget because of the 3.5 million committed to capital outlay next year. And then finally, that the jagged red line represents the percentage of the total budget associated with salaries and benefits. And so looking from left to right, you see that we were at about 86% at our high in salaries and budgets, salary and benefits of budget. And next fiscal year, we're anticipating it being right at about 80%, which is very sort of consistent with what most governments are spending in terms of proportion of budget that are service-driven organizations, service-driven municipalities, roughly in the 80 to 85% range in salaries and budgets, and salaries and benefits rather. Any questions on this then before I move on? Okay, on page 35, salary and benefit expenditures in specific. You see it's a little bit hard to read because there's a lot going on this, but you do see some growth in the PERS retirement portion of the expenditures. You also see obviously some absolute growth over the years in salaries and benefits. And then the red line represents the proportion associated with pension expenditures. And so if you recall earlier, I talked about the employee contributions. And so as employees began to contribute toward pension obligations, you saw as a percentage of expenditures, our pension costs were actually decreasing because employees were paying more in. However, that began to reverse beginning in 2018, primarily as a result of the first policy change that agencies need to provide a fixed amount of funding toward unfunded actuarial liability obligations. And that's driving the majority of the first cost increases. So it's going up in absolute dollar, and it's also going up as a percentage of our budget. So we now, for 21, are approaching 18% just on pension obligations. So every dollar spent is about 17.5% toward pensions of the salary and benefit expenditures. So moving on to page 36, this shows the retirement costs. And so if you can see, there's sort of a common theme with these graphs. We start out sort of discussing all revenues or all expenditures, and then in the successive graphs, we're honing in on the details associated with segments or portions of those revenues or expenditures. So in this case, this is sort of the slice of retirement costs. Lets you see that by itself, so you can see it a little bit more clearly that in 2016, we were just over 4 million in pension expenditures. And in 21, we're anticipating 6.75 million in expenditures. So definitely seeing some significant increases. You see that discretionary funding that was made in 18 and 19. So those amounts represent accelerated payments toward pension obligations, which, by the way, help minimize increases in the following years as a result of us paying down our obligations. So the good news with those light bar portion of those bars is that accelerates or pays in advance obligations that results in savings in future years. You don't see any light blue bar in 20 or 21, and that is because the policy speaks to the fact that in the event of district surpluses, then 1/3 of any surplus is earmarked toward discretionary funding. But last fiscal year, we operated essentially at break even. And this fiscal year, we are anticipating a small operating deficit. So as a result of that, in the successive years thereafter, there is no provision automatically for any discretionary funding for pension obligations. In a presentation at mid-year, I had referenced that staff was likely to come back and recommend discretionary funding payment late in this fiscal year, even though we had not realized a surplus last year. However, as a result of the uncertainty in the markets, staff has not opted to make that recommendation. Nevertheless, it would be the discretion of the board at any point to make additional discretionary funding payments. However, for purposes of the 21 budget, since we're not anticipating surplus in the current fiscal year, we have not automatically included any discretionary funding toward pension obligations in next year's budget. So skipping forward to page 39, this shows a fund balance graphic between 12 and 21. We were at 19.7 the total fund balance 10 years ago. We're at 23.5. The biggest change there is that restricted portion in the 21 budget, which now represents 26% of total fund balance, and that is associated with the 115 trust. So again, those funds are specifically restricted or earmarked toward pension obligations, and that does present somewhat of a safety net or safety valve toward future pension obligations by allowing the district, if determined to be appropriate, to take some of that 115 money and put that toward pension obligations. To remind the board and others on this call, we had a presentation earlier in the fiscal year by Martell and Associates about strategies for using 115 trust monies, and in the short term, that's been put on hold because of the uncertainties associated with COVID-19. But nevertheless, it is important to just restate that we do have that $6 million plus in the 115 trust that can be put directly toward pensions in the future. So at this point, I'm going to move relatively light years forward to page 57. So please let me know if there's any questions between page 39 and page 57. Otherwise, we'll move to 57. And from here forward, we'll be skipping a number of pages. So I appreciate you bearing with me on this. So here, staffing overview and departmental reporting. Just want to point out this report to you and indicate that district's total full-time equivalent employees are 145.3 in the 21 budget, and that is unchanged. There's no funding or requests for additional positions between the current fiscal year and the 21 budget. And then the graphic right below that just shows that the vast majority of our staffing is in emergency services positions with above that community risk reduction and administration. Those bracketed numbers represent the full-time equivalent staff associated with each of those three divisions. Going to page 58, the next page. Just quickly, the table here shows the district's current labor commitments, Teamsters, professional firefighters, and unrepresented employees. And this shows that we have existing commitments both on the safety and on the confidential unrepresented side. At this point in time, Teamsters and the district are in negotiations for an MOU that expires at the end of this fiscal year. So moving forward, again, we're going to sort of jump light years ahead to page 86. So if there are any questions between that 56 and 86, then we'll take those now. So hearing none, just don't want to read through this section in details, but just bring to your attention that the budgetary practices and financial policies section of the budget outline, I think in pretty significant detail, the policies that go into the district's accounting and budgeting practices, which are in compliance with generally accepted accounting standards and governmental accounting standards as well. And we wouldn't be able to achieve our financial reporting and budget excellence report rewards or recognitions, I should say, without achieving those standards. And so just want to bring to your attention that within this section of the report are a number of associated policies that are important to include in the document. So moving forward into the budget detail section, page 96. So we're going to jump 10 pages. This is a 5-year summary of the budget. And so just present some context in terms of growth and revenues and expenditures and net operating revenues. You see in 17-18, those were years where we were able to make significant dollars due largely to continuing growth in the revenue stream. And that 2019 number there, earlier I indicated that 2019 was largely a break-even year. You'll note the footnote there that says the totals exclude the 115 trust net earnings in effect. So when you add back the net earnings for 2019, we were slightly positive. And then for 20, we are projecting a deficit. And in 21, slight positive when you add back in the transfers to capital replacement. So moving on to 97, the next page. This just shows the 2-year presentation on changes in fund balance. Because we are using those transfers from the equipment replacement fund to fund a good portion of our capital next year. We do see the overall fund balance go from 25.4 this year to 23.5 approximately next fiscal year. So moving on to page 101, 2 pages forward there. Revenue history. Again, this shows the 5-year history. So all of these successive reports show over 5 years in detail revenues and expenditures. So going on to page 102. Beginning on page 102, this expenditure history report, again over 5 years, shows this at what we would call a fund level or essentially a district-wide level compared to the report starting on page 104, which is the divisional expenditure history, and that shows in more detail the expenditures on a division basis, meaning administration, community risk reduction, and emergency services. So it's a more detailed version of the expenditure report with a lot of detail included in there. Moving on to page 108. This shows the 2-year comparison between current amended budget and the 21 budget and the associated changes, both as a percentage and as absolute dollar between the 2 fiscal years.
Steve?
Yes.
Steve, this is Wynn. I was wanting to see if you could bring up page 106. I had some questions.
Okay, 106.
Uh-huh.
There we are.
On these, I noticed some huge differences over the years in these, and I was wanting to know if you can give me an idea of why there would be such huge differences. One of them I'm looking at is 60-37, where it's coverage of workers' comp. I know the workers' comp has gone up, and 60-45 separation of payments.
Sure.
And,
So, yeah.
And what is the separation of payments and so on?
Well, let's start with the 60-37. So 60-37 is directly attributable to what was described previously in terms of an increasing trend toward the average number of full-time equivalent employees we've had on illness and injury. So that translates directly, in this case, to additional coverage or overtime costs associated with covering for those individuals that are out. And so, yeah, you have seen over the last couple of years in particular some substantial increases in that line. And I know you didn't ask about the 62-35, the workers' comp expense, but that's the other component for the care and treatment, administration, and legal costs associated with that. And so you see some proportionately significant increases in that line as well. So in combination, those two represent the 3.4 million I referenced in workers' comp cases costs earlier. And then going to your question about separation payments represent accrued leave balances for anybody that separates from the district, and that traditionally has been driven by retirements. Occasionally there are non-retirees separating from the district. They don't typically have large accrual balances on the books. As folks retire out, the lion's share of those dollars is going into a health retirement account that was set up in more recent years to provide for future healthcare costs for those individuals as they retire out. They are required to include accrued leave balances at retirement into those accounts. So that does show as a separation payment, but those dollars then go into an account that can be drawn out for premiums and associated healthcare costs over the retiree's lifetime. So we're pleased that that provides dollars that can be used toward future medical after folks retire from the district.
So that fluctuates from year to year. I notice in 17 there's like 491,000, and then in 19 it goes down to 69,000, and then it's back up to 382,000 in 2021.
Yes, correct. As far as the budget goes, we sort of look in our crystal ball and take our best guess, because we don't know who and how many may choose to separate from the district, again, primarily through retirement. So, you know, it's always a rough number as far as the upcoming budget is concerned. We want to have enough dollars in there so that we're not well short. But the numbers in the prior payments, yeah, those represent actual separations, which again are primarily retirements. So it just sort of depends who and how many retire in any given year.
So I take it in 19 we didn't have too many retire.
That's correct.
Okay,
Just
thank you. And then the deferred comp benefit went from 30,000 in 17 clear up to 421 in 20 and 560. What is that deferred comp benefit?
That primarily represents, the increases primarily represent that labor and the board through negotiations have agreed that in lieu of increases in compensation, the district is providing contributions toward a 401A deferred compensation program. The benefit to the employees is that is put into a savings account, post-retirement savings account for the employee. And the benefit, the huge benefit to the district of that is that if we gave that equivalent amount in a salary increase, then we would have to pay the PERS associated amount with that. And so the district and the employee groups have been looking for ways to enhance benefits in lieu of salary increase, to not have to increase proportionately the costs toward retirement. So what you're seeing, Director Williams, beginning in 19, is part of that negotiated in lieu of salary increase amount going to toward 401A benefits.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. I understand now, and
Sure.
you know, when I see something like that, it just kind of a curious thing of what's going on. One other question I have on that page is on the next area, 7043 on electronics equipment. There's also a substantial jump from 17 to 21. Do you know what that's about?
Yeah, in general, yes. So we talked about in the new this year section of the budget several technology implications. In particular, over the last couple of fiscal years, there has been a significant move toward technology. A lot of that has been in the cardiac care area. Additionally, like we highlighted in the new this year, a lot of that as well is in emergency services technology. So additional access to information, additional new equipment, programs, services, those types of technological advances for the benefit of the services to the community. So, you know, you're just seeing the influence of doing more with technology and trying to be more cutting edge.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I just want to say this is excellent. And this area of the budget is, to me, one of the best areas, because when I see changes like that, then I can get explanations, and thank you very much. And
Well,
I'm finished.
Okay, well, so as long as we're on that page, I'll just point out one more, since we're sort of along those themes, and that has to do with the 7445 services dispatch. You saw a big jump last fiscal year, and now it's decreasing. That was because last fiscal year, or actually the current fiscal year, we had a one-time cost associated with a buy-in for Confire JPA membership, so that we would have a voting interest in the dispatch, the regional dispatch.
Uh-huh.
So that's why that number jumped to $1 million and then back down into the 600s.
And what number was that on the?
7445.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
All right. So if there are
Very
no
good.
other questions, sure, of course, anytime. Let's move back to page 109, please. So 109, and I apologize, I know the print is small. You might have to get your magnifying glass out for this, but this does show between 20 and 21 variances in dollars and associated percent changes. And then the column to the far right indicates our comments. So this does provide some additional context on changes between 20 and 21, both on the salary and benefits side and on the services and supplies side. So I think that just adds some additional context. And then as we get on the home stretch, beginning on page 110, our budget line item transactional report for all items in the budget in excess of $5,000. And so President Luth, I'll defer to you if you feel that there's an interest. We can certainly either go page by page, or if there are specific questions on any specific transactions that are listed in this next section of the report, I'll defer to you to provide direction on that, if you would.
Okay, so at this point, do any of the directors have any questions on pages 110 and on there where we've got the detail on the 5,000 and over transactions?
It's Mike Krieger. I do regarding the general liability insurance. Can you?
Certainly. If HR Director Kuchwara is on the line, Christy, would you mind taking that one?
I sure will. Yeah, thank you, Steve. Director Krieger, on the general liability, we received a letter recently from SDRMA, our insurer, that stated that due to the impact of catastrophic losses throughout the state and even throughout the world, that they were having an increase of losses and cost of claims. And based on those factors and the overall pool claims cost over the past several years, that an increase in rates were necessary. And it's a proposed 62% increase. Does that help clarify?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm in this industry and I see the trends of what's happening, and what I'm not seeing is 62% increases. So obviously that jumped out at me, and
absolutely. Yeah,
makes me concerned, A, and B, makes me wonder if we should be looking at a different program.
We have been asking around, and there does seem to be a trend with in the insurance area, general liability, that they are increasing. We don't have specifics on the percentages agency to agency.
Yeah, I know that the Fire District Association of California has a program as well, specifically for fire districts. And I didn't know if we wanted to seek out an additional quote just to make sure. I mean, SDRMA's been fantastic. They've been great. They've been a fantastic partner. But 62%'s a heavy pill to swallow.
Agreed.
Big number for sure.
Can I ask a question? This is Win.
Yes.
Yeah, I was wanting to know, is SDRMA everything but workers' comp?
It is also workers' comp. We contract them with them for general property and workers' comp.
Okay, so even the workers' comp could be part of the large increase.
It is not, those are billed separately. And we're not seeing, as far as premiums are concerned, that a significant increase such as this.
Okay, so the workers' comp is billed separately, even though they're both under the same company, or so to speak.
That is correct.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? So just to dovetail on Krieger's comments, is there time to even solicit another bid? When does our insurance renew?
It's
July 1.
Fiscal year, yeah, July 1.
Okay. So at this point, there would be potentially time to solicit some other bids.
According to SDRMA, if we wanted to look at alternative liability with them, we would have needed to contact them by April 30th. But as far as us looking at other plans elsewhere, that we're at liberty to do that.
Okay. It might behoove us to take a look. I agree with Director Krieger. They've been awful good to us. That's a pretty significant jump. It might be worth getting some other input before we get too much further down the road.
Yeah, I would suggest looking at the FDAC program. This is not standard, general liability insurance for a municipality and with the kind of equipment that we have. So, you can't go to State Farm and get a quote. You have to go to a specific program for this. So there's not a lot of options out there, but I'd be interested just to know. I mean, this very well could be exactly what we should be paying. In the past years, I felt that the cost that we were paying was very, very, very good compared to the risk, in my opinion. So, maybe we're just catching up to what it should be at this point.
Yeah.
We can definitely look into that.
Okay. Any other comments or questions at this point? We'll get to comments later. All right, Steve.
Okay, we're going to move then to 119, the long-range financial planning overview, and wrap up here in just a couple of minutes in terms of my presentation. So thank you for bearing with us. So on page 119 there, this just is a companion narrative to the long-range financial plan. And just want to point a couple things out. So the long-range financial plan is a 10-year horizon. Just for planning and discussion purposes. Obviously, the further out we get on the 10-year scale, the less likely that those numbers will be accurate because of a variety of assumptions and uncertainties that are associated with any sort of 10-year outlook. The long-range financial plan assumes at this point Fire Station 68 coming online in mid-fiscal 23. So a couple of years out, and then potentially a Station 69 opening toward the end of the 10-year horizon in fiscal 28. That's, eons away, but nevertheless included in the 10-year plan. And there's also a key assumptions table on page 120. I'm not going to take the time to go over that. I'll just draw your attention to that. So if we conclude this part on page 121, the next page. just want to bring your attention to that short paragraph second from the bottom that says, as the long-term fiscal impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic are not determinable nor reasonably estimable at this time, well, that's a mouthful. No long-term provision for the possible associated fiscal impacts have been included in the long-range financial plan at this point in time. So that's important to know, that we know that there's something looming out there, but until we get additional information, we have not included anything in the long-range financial plan, which is on page 122, the next page. Just a couple of quick comments on here. There's a lot going on and a lot of numbers, but toward the middle of the expenditure section is the unfunded actuarial liability payment increases. And so we have built in a specific line that looks at how much more we're going to pay PERS for unfunded actuarial liability payments. And so that is built directly into the plan. And then finally there at the very bottom in the black shaded red print line shows total fund balances. So based on this analysis and the associated assumptions, fund balance at the end of 10 years is substantially similar to where we are now. With that said, the unknown impacts of COVID-19 could significantly impact the district's outlook over the next certainly 5 to 10 years. And so this may or may not look significantly different when we update it after we have additional information with regard to PERS obligations, and then we see the potential impacts, if any, on revenues from property tax associated monies. So just keep that in mind, that we are at a very sort of uncertain crossroads in that regard. And so as I sort of wrap up here, I'll sort of end with where I began, which is with regard to the pending recession. I think that any economists who said we might go into recession have now changed to this is definite. Again, is it a V? Is it a U? I don't know what that really looks like. But fiscal 21 does present an opportunity here for us to begin to do everything we can to ensure that we're fiscally prudent and trying to stay ahead of the curve for what may impact us in, if you're looking at the long range plan here, years 3, 4, 5, and beyond as a result of any impacts of recession. So hopefully we plan for the worst and get better than that, but still difficult to know at this time what the sustained long-term impacts on district finances are of recession. So with that, I'm confident that we've presented a comprehensive look at 2021 and pleased with the document that we've delivered to you today. We are not asking for any board action, just simply any direction that may come out of the discussion. And as I wrap up my comments, I just wanted to ask Chief Shackelford if he had any final remarks before we turn it back over to the board.
Again, I just wanted to thank you and your staff, Steve, for doing a great job putting this together. It's a group effort, and it goes beyond our finance staff. This goes all the way down to our line personnel and folks in all aspects of the organization, providing input and really trying to predict what those expenses will be. I just did want to circle back with President Luth for some clarity on the insurance piece. And would it be acceptable to you and Director Krieger, without formally getting direction from the board, that we look into it and do an initial inquiry on the insurance? And if it seems to be a benefit, meaning we can do an apples to apples comparison and it looks like there's some potential savings, then we would bring something formal to the board for consideration, since we do have a limited timeline here with just over a month before the fiscal year starts. Would that address your concerns with it?
It would mine, Director Krieger.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly what I'm looking for, Tim.
Okay, we'll get going on that right away. And if it seems promising, we'll figure out how to bring that to the board. We'll work with legal counsel and the clerk of the board to make sure we get that agendized properly if there is something there. And if not, I will report back to the board to let you know what the findings were, but it won't necessarily be a formal agenda item if that's okay.
That's fine with me. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
So President Luke, that concludes my remarks. And with that, I turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So first up, clerk of the board, do we have any public comment on this agenda item?
President Luce, we have no public comment on this agenda item.
Thank you. This is the time for the board to comment, so we'll go down through the ranks here, and we'll start with Director Williams. Any comments at this point?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I do have a couple of things for Steve. One question I have is the fact that we have SDRMA for workers' comp. Are we still considered to be self-insured?
Yes,
Okay.
it's a self-insured school.
All right. And that was my question on that one. And the other thing is what am I going to look at, Steve, if you put up the predictions from 10 years ago on our stuff? You know, we got the 10-year prediction here.
Yeah.
I was kind of curious as to how things would look for the predictions of 2010.
Yeah.
Just be interesting. Thanks.
Actually, that's an interesting exercise. I actually think you would find that we're fairly well aligned with where we expected we would be 10 years ago. With that said, you know, no one, of course, anticipated a worldwide pandemic and the associated impacts that may come from that. But as far as, you know, sort of everything we could predict and plan for, I think, while not being spot on, much credit to the board for leadership and vision that over the last 10 years, while we're not immune from challenges, we've been very proactive and I think have managed the limited resources we have very effectively.
Well, thank you very much. It was no way a criticism. It was more of a curiosity.
Of course.
And, I think it's absolutely astounding that you can go and do that as much as you do and as well as you do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Director Krieger.
Yeah, I just want to thank staff and Steve very much for putting this document together. This was fantastic. You know, every year you just put out better and better documents and make it easier to read and more relevant and with more data, and I really do appreciate that. And I really do appreciate, you know, Tim, with you and the rest of the leadership and the district as a whole, everybody being very cost sensitive for the past several years, and really doing what you can to make sure that we are run conservatively and that we're looking at the big picture of the future and the future health of the district. So thank you very much, and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Director Krieger. Director DeMonico.
Yes, thank you for a great presentation, Steve. I've been here for a number of the budgets, quite a few, and they get better and more transparent every year. I've been through this one a number of times, and it's just a great job on it. And a lot of the questions that I could have had are answered in the budget as well as I read it. I would like to make one comment about SDRMA. I think we need to be careful what we wish for. SDRMA has been a great partner for us. We've had a lot of interaction with them. We've had a number of different scenarios or incidents where they've been involved with us, and they've just been a great asset. So to me, it's just not what we're paying for the insurance. I think we've had great rates from them. What do we get in return? I think we really need to consider that before we really just start going out looking to, for lack of better words, Cheap Charlie this. And that's my comment on that. But again, thank you for a great presentation. I think this is good. I'm looking forward to the June 10th meeting for final adoption. And those conclude my comments.
Thank you, Vice President Ramos Evinger.
Thank you so much for the presentation and for all the hard work, and just really great job. And that's all my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, Steve, when you started this on page 7, you thanked the board for the accomplishments that are noted there. And I think obviously a huge amount of thanks goes to you and your staff and the entire group of people that get involved in this process, and which is quite extensive, that gets us to this point. So I appreciate your comments, but I also want to recognize that your leadership, your group, your team have done an excellent job here and do a great job of handling our finances. You did a wonderful job walking through this report. It's hard to come up with any questions. You did a really good job of explaining things, and I appreciate that. The other thing I really appreciate about this budget is our budget continue to find ways to support improvement in the district. The First Do Community Connect, the FirstWatch, the Tablet Command, all the initiatives on page 21 are, we continue to try to improve the district's ability to serve our communities, and so I appreciate that. I did have one thing, I should have probably brought this up earlier, and it's a small item, but in light of what's going on, do we consider the state of the district production? Whether or not we do that, I don't know if that's something we need to bring back to the board when this comes for final adoption, but I'd sure like to consider that at that time, whether we need to move forward with that this year, given everything that's going on. Is that really appropriate? Do we need it? I think they do a wonderful job. They do a wonderful production for us, but I don't know that we need it this year. So I'd certainly like to have that as part of the consideration when we bring this for final adoption. And then the only other concern I have, so at this point, this budget, it factors in that the engine purchase that we have going on for the 4, you remain confident in the numbers and we're going to be fine. The savings are real in bringing the 4 engines versus the 2, which was just going to be a year delay, the 2 and 2 versus the 4. So I appreciate you laying that out for us again in the budget process. And then, one other question, if I may, see, are there grants and things, and are we applying for any type of grants in the various programs that have come out, and especially in lieu of the COVID thing? Are there any opportunities for the district regarding any grants?
Great question. Thank you for that. Yes, the short answer to that is yes, and yes. So we have filed 1 grant application associated with personal protective equipment through FEMA already. And so that has been filed. And thank you to Don Burns for taking the lead, along with Dean Smith on the operational side, and others involved in that process. So yes, 1 PPE grant already. There are costs associated with our countywide team participation that we are working with the county to seek reimbursement through FEMA. It appears that there are some advantages in that respect to going through county for that portion of potentially recoverable expenses. And then finally, we have filed a request for public assistance, which is associated with the national and state declarations of emergency under COVID-19. That's sort of the umbrella granting mechanism for covering what they call unbudgeted costs, so whether that would be overtime costs and additional staffing costs, as well as services and supplies directly associated with the incident. So we recently confirmed with state OES that we have received approval for our public assistance grant process, which is the first step toward cost recovery. And so in that regard, 75% of eligible costs that aren't covered under one of the other grants should be recoverable for associated costs with the incident. At this point in time, we have not included any additional revenue associated with those potential cost recoveries. So I'm not expecting a huge upside, but there should be additional monies coming through as we receive approvals and receive those funds when reimbursed. Some of those funds will be able to be fast-tracked. I don't anticipate we'll necessarily receive anything before the end of the fiscal year, but we should see some next fiscal year. However, in terms of the final settlements of those, there could also be some delays, just because that's sort of the way that the Fed works. But hopefully we'll see, a flow of cost recovery through this, and so we're diligently pursuing that.
Great, thank you. And you answered the second part already. It's not in our budget, so that there will be hopefully some slight upside, so that's great.
Yeah.
And I would also comment, Director Delmonico's comment regarding our insurance. I tend to agree. I believe that we have a great partner there. I just think it is prudent to do a little gut check, and my sense is we're going to find that we've had an incredible rate, and we're now more in line with where maybe we should be. But I do agree they have been a wonderful partner for us, and I don't want to take that lightly. All right, before we move off of this, do any directors have any final comments they'd like to make?
No comment.
All right. All right, then, this item does not require a motion. The purpose of this item was for staff to present the report and receive any board input or direction to staff. All right, so now we are going to move on to board comments, and we'll start with Director Williams.
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you guys. I just have a few things that I'd like to bring up. One thing I would like to do is get the board policy for my opportunity to get paid for electronics for the use of phone and my computer. I haven't gotten any of that yet since I've been on the board. And I would think that under the circumstances, everybody knows that I've had a phone and a computer, and so it should be retro. So that's one thing that I was wanting to talk to the board about. And one other thing I'd like to talk to the board about is the fact of everything that's gone on since I've been on the board. And the way I'd like to present it is, when I had the accident involving myself and my wife, we had an accident with a drunk. I'm sorry about running into that drunk driver. Even though it wasn't my fault, I have to say that I'm sorry about that because of the way things worked out. And so by the same thing as that, I'm sorry about asking for the 2 copies that I caused all the trouble for me since I've been on the board. Even though it has been determined by the $35,000 investigator that the request was district related, I'm sorry that it has occurred. And here again, it wasn't my fault, but just like running into the drunk, I'm sorry that happened. So I'd like to have those things taken care of and find out what I have to do to get paid for, like I say, the phone and stuff. One thing too that I'm wanting to say is I'm a little disappointed about the fact that President Luth has not been the peacemaker that I thought he would be and put this stuff behind me and behind us and the board. And one thing, I was going over the policy for the board members, and it talked about being polite. And I was wondering how polite it was for Sarah to make a request for me to resign at my second board meeting. I'll not get over that anytime soon, if ever. And if any of you have any input about my situation, you know, give me a call, talk to me. I'm more than willing to talk to you if you're willing to do anything. I mean, you know, let's put this behind us, because I have about probably 25, 30 more meetings, and you know, it's just going to be brought up more and more, and we don't need to do that. We need to find out what we can do to make peace. Oh, and one thing I wanted to ask about too, has there been any talk about possibly doing live meetings again, or participating meetings? I went by Station 1 the other day, and of course they've got a huge bay there and everything, and it was Saturday, and they were out checking the equipment, so the bays were all empty and everything. And I was wondering, you know, if there's any possibility of us having live meetings where we can do spacing and stuff. You've seen them on TV and that type of thing. And instead of having these kind of meetings, these meetings are okay, but face-to-face seems to be much better. And I just was wanting to know if there's been any talk about that. And I think with that said, I think that's all I wanted to say tonight, and this afternoon, that is. And thank you, everyone. And it was a great meeting. I want to thank Steve for the great presentation. I'm sorry that we couldn't do it live, but we are moving along the way we have to. And thank you very much again. Thank you.
Okay, Director, just one question. I understand you want a hard copy of the board policy. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes,
Okay.
I'd like to get that.
Okay.
If possible.
Yeah, no, I think we understand, and it's an important document. I would ask, as each subsequent director gives their comments, if you also need a hard copy, please make that comment. So if we need to make more than one copy, we can make those at this time. All right, so we'll move on to Director Krieger.
Once again, I'd just like to thank everybody for the hard work and the presentation tonight. And that's it for me tonight. Thank you.
All right, Director DeMonico.
Yes, I'd like to thank everybody for a great meeting. I thought we had a great presentation, and again, Steve, I just think you do a tremendous job with this thing. I don't need a hard copy of the board policies. It's both on Goodreader and on the webpage, so I'm good without a hard copy. So thank you, and hopefully we'll see everybody on June 10th. I don't know if we'll be back in a boardroom or not, but I hope we're getting close. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice President Ramos-Evinger.
No comment other than just thank you very much for the presentations, for everything today. And I, as well as Director DeMonico, I have full access to the board policies via the internet as well as Goodreader, so I don't need a copy. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, I would also, again, just thank you to everybody who was involved in this process, putting this budget together. It had to be more difficult this year, I'm sure, with everything we've been dealing with here, working remotely, and yet staff and everybody involved rose to the occasion, and I very much appreciate the effort. Steve, thank you for the presentation. You did a great job, very detailed. You answer questions before there's questions, and I very much appreciate it. And in regard to a live meeting, I hope so. We certainly will be discussing that. See when and how soon we can have a face-to-face meeting again. I would look forward to that very much as well. All right, and with that, this meeting will be adjourned to a regular meeting of the Board of Directors of the Chino Valley Independent Fire District to be held on Wednesday, June 10th, 2020. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.